A special welcome to those who are watching this later on video. Today, my talk is on paranoia and politics. Watching the news, wherever of the many places you get that these days, it might seem to you as if our world is suddenly experiencing a mass outbreak of paranoia, especially in the political realm. And while that may feel very today, it is a phenomenon that has been part of the American political scene for a very long time. I actually first researched this topic for a paper in college and first delivered a talk at an ethical society on this 13 years ago. And so on Thursday afternoon, when I had to pivot suddenly and find something to speak about when our speakers for this week moved to November, I was able to adapt that older talk for today. I was surprised myself to see how little of it actually needed changing. Paranoia and politics, it's really not that new. I'll begin with a story I first heard told by a teacher of mine, Edwin Friedman. Once upon a time, there was a man who thought he was dead. All of his family and friends kept trying to convince him that he was alive, but nothing availed. He just knew he was dead. The family even took him to see a doctor who declared that he was alive. Well, that just convinced him that the doctor was incompetent. They took him to see a therapist. The therapist tried to use logic and reason to convince him that he was not dead. He decided the therapist was crazy. Finally, the therapist had an idea. He asked the man if dead people bleed. No, dead people can't bleed, said the man. So the therapist talked him into a test. He would prick the man's finger, and if he bled, then he must be alive. The family gathered around as the therapist pricked the man's finger. The man saw the drop of the blood on his finger and exclaimed, "I was wrong." He turned to his family. Dead men do bleed. People believe the strangest things, and often such beliefs are resistant to logic and reason, testing, and hours of argument. 13 years ago, when I first spoke on this topic, in the news was the so-called birther argument. First, it started with the allegation during the 2007 to 08 election season that Barack Obama was not eligible to run for president. And the first version of this was it was because he was born in Hawaii before it was a state. Now, never mind that the same was true of Barry Goldwater in Arizona, or that John McCain was born in the Panama Canal Zone. I received a few of those emails about this from relatives and friends. It didn't take long to debunk that story. Just a quick check of the date of Obama's birth and the date of Hawaii's admission into the Union, and poof, the rumor would be over. Well, no, instead we saw the rumor change. The same people started sending around emails with a new assertion. Now, there had been a plot beginning at the time of Obama's birth to cover up the supposed fact that he was born in Kenya, the country of his father's origin. A plot from the time of his birth to cover it all up. Now, never mind that if there were such a plot, it would have been a lot simpler just to make sure his mother was on US soil when she gave birth. Politicians, when interviewed at the time, often refused, and mostly along party lines, to suggest that the rumors were bunk. And they mumbled non-committal lines like, "We need to know more." Well, today we have QAnon and people who truly believe that despite lack of evidence, Biden stole the election, that Biden is really his predecessor in a skin suit, that martial law has already been declared, and that the 45th president is about to be reinstated. So I want you to listen to this quote and see if it resonates. The modern right wing feels dispossessed. America has been largely taken away from them and their kind, though they are determined to repossess it and to prevent the final destructive act of subversion. The old American virtues have already been eaten away by cosmopolitans and intellectuals. The old competitive capitalism has been gradually undermined by socialistic and communistic schemers. The old national security and independence has been destroyed by treasonous plots, having as their most powerful agents not merely outsiders and foreigners as of old, but major statesmen who are at the very centers of American power. Their predecessors had discovered conspiracies. The modern radical right finds conspiracy to be betrayal from on high. Well, does that quote sound like a description of what's going on? It's a quote from a professor of history at Columbia University from Harper's Magazine, an article entitled "The Paranoid Style in American Politics." Richard Hofstadter, 1964. That's 57 years ago. Hofstadter, in that 1964 article, was trying to convey that such rumors in that time of treasonous plots and conspiracies, cries that we want our country back, were not new. He documented trends going back to the 18th century. In the 19th century, it was populists talking about secret cabals of the international gold ring. More recently, in the memory of 1964, it was Senator Joseph McCarthy's pursuit of communists plotting from within the government. Well, I spent a couple of years writing about the Salem witch craze of 1692 and 93 and other witch hunts of history. I even got quoted at one point in the New York Times on that topic, when the former guy started saying that investigations of his obstruction of justice was a witch hunt. I've been struck by the parallels of that older witch craze to the politics of paranoia, as was Arthur Miller in writing The Crucible, which was a thinly disguised critique of McCarthyism. In 1692, two girls, 11 and 9 years old, began having strange fits, similar to those described a couple of years before that in a book by a popular Boston Puritan preacher, Cotton Mather. A doctor suggested that there was no physical cause for their fits, and so it must be the work of the devil. So one girl's father, a Puritan minister himself, pressured the girls to identify the person through whom the devil was working. The girls identified three easy targets. First, a family slave, Tituba, who was a Caribbean Indian woman. Second, a local beggar woman with a short temper who often cursed people she didn't like. And third, a woman who rarely attended church, was believed by her neighbors to have had premarital sex with an indentured servant who she later married, and who was also involved in some property disputes with the family of one of the girls. Well, after the initial accusations, they escalated. More accusers got involved, eventually expanding to include surrounding towns. When one man publicly expressed his conviction that the accusations were false, he was accused and became one of the 19 people who were eventually hanged on Gallows Hill, among hundreds accused, many others imprisoned, often losing their property and their health. Scholars and popular writers still argue over the causes of the Salem witch craze. Kids wanting attention, hallucinogenic wheat, even one modern scholar suggesting that there were actually witches in Salem Village. Most scholars agree that the craze began at a time of serious social unrest and political change. The Puritans were losing influence. A new charter from England required them to share political power with local Anglicans. There were a lot of fears around very real violent incidents between the colonists and some Native Americans. The Native Americans had responded to killings and what they saw as a dangerous invasion by going to war to drive out those invaders. One Salem accuser had seen her parents killed in that war. When one accused witch confessed to dreams about being dragged from her home by Indians, that was actually taken as evidence that she had actually been taken in the night by the devil. Such incredible social unrest, such times of change, often produce fear. and that fear often turns to paranoia. Paranoia being defined as an unreasonable, unfounded, exaggerated fear. In what Richard Hofstadter in 1964 named the paranoid style, very real fear is then attributed to powerful, vast conspiracies. Hofstadter carefully explained that he didn't mean that the people who believed such stories were psychologically paranoid, but he believed that the fact that psychologically normal people believed such exaggerated or made up stories was even more significant. Hofstadter's contribution to that 1960s look at paranoid politics was to show that in America it was a phenomenon of long-standing, not something unique and unusual. And he pointed out that it wasn't uniquely American either, but his interest was more in showing American examples. Hofstadter, for instance, quoted a 19th century Texas newspaper accusing the monarchs of Europe and the Pope of Rome of trying to take over America. He mentioned 19th century anti-Mormon exaggerations, some of which escalated to mobs of murderous violence. He looked at accusations that the Masons were anti-Christian, anti-American, anti-property rights, and even pro-abortion. Those different instances also usually included accusations that the press was biased or muzzled. Immigrants were often the target of the conspiracy theories. Samuel F.B. Morse, who invented the telegraph, also wrote a book about a supposed Habsburg conspiracy, where the Austrian rulers were planning to take over America and turn it Catholic through the work of Jesuit missionaries, and then to establish an American emperor. Lyman Beecher, the famous 19th century preacher and father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote and spoke of, quote, a great tide of immigration hostile to free institutions, unquote, and about the evils of Catholicism and the potentates of Europe. The circulation of bogus documents in service of such paranoia is also nothing new, well before email. In the 1890s, a group called the American Protective Association sent around a fake encyclical, supposedly from Pope Leo XIII, which named a date in 1893 when Catholics in America were supposedly ordered to rise up and kill all heretics, meaning all Protestants. In the 20th century, the New Deal attracted a whole lot of paranoia. Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, had 40 million listeners to his 1930s weekly radio show. He's arguably the predecessor of today's radio and podcast conspiracists. He was pro-fascist, anti-New Deal. In a bit of a variation from today's paranoias, Father Coughlin argued for the redistribution of wealth to workers, for a national minimum wage, and for government regulation of the market. Although the reason he wanted that regulation was he believed the market was controlled by Jewish bankers and Jewish conspirators who became more and more his targets of contempt. His original problem with the New Deal was that he saw it as a tool of Wall Street and Jewish bankers. He was against immigration and against any foreign involvements. He expressed explicit admiration for Hitler and Mussolini. He actually defended the violence against Jews in the wake of Kristallnacht, saying it was the Christians who were persecuted first. Joseph Kennedy, father of the later president, led an effort to get the Vatican to silence Father Coughlin, but Catholic leadership feared that because of the popularity of that priest, action against him would lead to a schism in the American church, and they did nothing. Finally, he was driven off the air when an organization he founded called for the violent overthrow of the government, the killing of Jews, and establishing an American dictatorship modeled on Hitler's. Well, then there's a contemporary of Father Coughlin, Westbrook Pegler, a homophobic, anti-Semite, union-bashing columnist for the Scrip Howard News Syndicate, later with the Hearst Syndicate. He wrote a popular right-wing column from the 30s into the 60s. He hated the Roosevelts and the Kennedys, and in later years, he was associated with neo-Nazis and the White Citizens Council and the John Birch Society. The latter eventually found him too extreme even for them. Infamously, Sarah Palin used a quote from him in her 2008 convention speech after being nominated as the Republican candidate for vice president. She or her speechwriter knew, though, that referring to Pegler might be a problem, so they only referred to the source of her quote as a writer. Joseph McCarthy's paranoia in the 50s about communists infiltrating the government is infamous, and I don't need to say much about his contributions to paranoid politics. And then there's the John Birch Society, beginning in the 1950s. They warned of communist takeover by infiltrating high offices and even electing a secret communist as president. They saw internationalists in the US and the Soviet Union as conspiring together to build a new world order, giving over sovereignty of the US to the United Nations. We still hear those paranoid stories today. Robert Welch, the founder of the society and longtime head of the group, called Eisenhower a communist dupe. Key members of the John Birch Society were leaders of the party faction that supported Goldwater in 1964 for the Republican nomination. Some John Birchers were pro-business, proto-libertarians. The father of the more recently infamous Koch brothers was a founder of the John Birch Society. Birchers were later key in founding the paramilitary Minuteman groups. With the Birch Society being headquartered in Wisconsin, we saw a lot of them in my childhood there. My father got on their mailing list. He had the general principle of getting on these mailing lists to use up some part of their funds, but also on the principle of being informed. So from very early, I had the opportunity to read what the people inside that movement actually believed and said. And the obviously false logic and exaggerated fear was apparent even to the teenage me. Perhaps my interest in these kind of movements began with such experience, thus my paper on the topic for a course in college. Like Hofstadter, I don't think most who believe these stories are literally mentally ill. The fact that anyone can read such exaggerated or imagined stories and believe them is what is amazing and significant and scary to me. Conspiracy theories are also not all of the political right wing. Father Coughlin had a mix of left and right wing politics. Progressive and liberals have had their own share. Some left wing conspiracy theories about 9/11 rise to that level, I would say. The idea, for instance, that no plane hit the Pentagon that day, that it was an internal explosion created by the CIA. Well, for that to be true, it would require thousands of people to be in on the conspiracy without a single leak. Making up backstories of the hundreds of people killed on the plane, for instance, and the families continuing to pretend that they had lost some loved ones. Yes, it was true that before the 2000 election, some who later joined the administration said publicly that they hoped for an incident that would justify a war against Iraq. That fact is just well documented. But that documented truth for some got morphed and changed and exaggerated into massive conspiracies, ideas that were resistant to logic, reason, and evidence, ideas about conspiracies that required massive participation if they were true. In American politics, these paranoid theories usually mix in some way religion, politics, and economics. They often pick up on real fears of, quote, losing our country. Thus, the anti-immigrant or anti-internationalist thread that runs through many of them. Anti-Semitism is one expression that has long included fears of an international economic and political conspiracy. And paranoid theories also depend on having a huge number of highly skilled conspirators. How many people would have to be involved, really, for the current president to be the previous one just wearing a supposed skin suit? or for the current administration and a previous candidate for president to actually be in prison right now while appearing in all the media as if they're free, or that millions are dying from a vaccine that supposedly implants micro devices that connect to 5G cellular networks. Hofstadter argued in 1964 that post-World War II conspiracy theories held in common the idea of vast government control. Hofstadter suggested that a second theme was a government infiltrated by communists. Notice how today's paranoid politics often also include accusations of communism or socialism, though sometimes now mixed with references to fascism. In 2009, when I talked about this, it was not acceptable to be a fascist, but surprise, that's been changing. Or accusations often involve atheists or Muslims. Remember the accusations that Obama was a secret Muslim and a secret atheist and a fascist and a communist, which would really be quite an accomplishment. Hofstadter suggested a third theme of a network of agents working together in many institutions: education, the press, religion, beyond government. While in his time it was communist agents, later paranoid stories have been of liberal or secular humanist control of these institutions. Thus, the paranoid fantasy of Christians being persecuted through such supposed campaigns as a war on Christmas. QAnon revolves around the idea of a massive conspiracy in and beyond government. I would add that paranoid politics often involves some kind of apocalyptic thinking, good versus evil, and the end of the world as we know it if we don't destroy those evil conspirators. There are often sexual innuendos and fantasies and accusations leveled against supposed conspirators. The other is often depicted in grotesque ways. The stereotypes of those racially different or anti-Semitic depictions of Jews are a couple of examples. And today we hear accusations of child abuse and pedophilia. Many of those theories mirror anti-Semitic themes that go back to medieval times. Well, here's the key point. Hofstadter suggested that such paranoid incidents and events and movements are natural human responses. They are strongest during times of political, social, economic, and religious conflict. When some people believe that they have lost power or are about to lose power, they seek explanations, and these paranoid stories provide such explanations for them. If such natural tendencies are then exploited, if people with influence manipulate truth, exaggerate what's going on, even create controversies and stories out of whole cloth, those who are fearful of social change will believe those stories. And like with the man who thought he was dead, arguments and logic only drive the fantasies to new highs, like apocalyptic predictions of the end of the world. You demonstrate that a story is false, that does not decrease belief in the overall fantasy. It just allows people to change the dates. And believers often then adopt even more fantastic beliefs to justify their convictions. So what are we to do, especially when we meet someone who believes one of these stories? Well, first, I think it's important to realize that argument from logic and reason rarely does much good. We tend to have an unreasonable faith in reasonableness. When the paranoid beliefs are not based on reason, reason will have a difficult time touching them. You can try it once or twice because some people are open to reason. But if it doesn't take, don't persist. Like the man who believed he was dead, arguments may just drive the beliefs even further into the emotional core of that person's sense of reality. So second, I don't mean you ignore the paranoia. You tell your own truth matter-of-factly. and don't expect it to have an immediate conversion effect on the person. Give your reasons for your beliefs calmly as what you believe. Over time, some of this will take, at least with some of the believers. Or sometimes it simply marginalizes the core stubborn believers, peeling off those at the edges of the paranoid group who are more open to truth and reality. Or at the minimum, it will convince the true believer that you're not someone to bother trying to convert, and they'll leave you alone. Third, humor seems to work better than logic and reason. And by humor, I don't mean mean-spirited mockery, but the kind of humor that reduces the argument to absurdity. The power of a Stephen Colbert in his former show was immense. Telling the truth and using humor will peel off some of the support for the paranoid politics for people who are at the edges of that. And fourth, don't buy into conspiracy theories yourself. Question yourself whenever you find yourself dividing the world rigidly into good and evil, and especially when you begin to think that the evil people have amazing powers to carry out their plans and to keep all their activities secret. Fifth, don't demonize the paranoids. Or as one friend says, don't stupidize them. That's just another way to divide the world into absolute good and absolute evil, complete right versus complete wrong. Besides not being practical in convincing anyone, it also tempts us to a reverse paranoia. A corollary to not demonizing or stupidizing them, realize that under that paranoia is some real fear. Specific explanations about why it is happening may be inaccurate, but fear is neither wrong nor right. It just is. Today, a huge fear is that white people are being displaced, or men are all going to be accused of sexual assault for saying a wrong word. Look for the real needs that the person is wanting met. And where you can, look for ways to meet those without giving in to the fantasies. Often just being a calm presence and not being anxious in hearing the fears can go a very, very long way to helping someone get to a state where they are able to respond to logic and reason and compassion. If you are able to do that without yourself having fears triggered. If we merely mock someone's views, we are heard as minimizing and dismissing not just their beliefs, but their underlying real values and needs, like the desire to matter, the desire to belong. It's not an accident that paranoia is at its strongest when society is going through economic, political, religious, or social change. Change is uncomfortable and often scary. What we know from many who have emerged from such paranoid beliefs is that it is almost always because there were compassionate people who did not mock them or stupidize them, didn't argue with them, but continued to respect them as the kind of people who had the possibility of knowing better and doing better, even while calmly expressing their own different opinions. So the sixth thing you can do is work over the long term for the education of all children, and even adults where that's still possible, in critical thinking skills and skill in managing fear and anger. Those of you who are parents and or teachers have a really good opportunity to contribute strongly here to the future. And seventh, don't minimize the power and impact of paranoid politics. It is a mistake to believe that such beliefs are merely stupid and can be ignored, or that we can cure the overall trend just by being kind and compassionate. The larger group that does not change will continue to have an impact. Just as when one of your children hits someone, you can love that child while stopping them from hitting, then later work on their anger management skills. We can stop a paranoid trend by organizing to keep them from power. And that brings us to the eighth and final one, and I think most important one, which is to organize. To paraphrase a religious teacher, the paranoid we will always have with us. They will often use democratic means to achieve undemocratic ends. It is incumbent upon those of you who don't believe their paranoid view of the world to organize politically for what you support. Politicians often cannot afford to ignore those who believe paranoid ideas because they vote. So it's not just demanding different candidates. Candidates need to know they have supporters who vote and organize at least as effectively as the paranoid believers do. You also need to organize for programs and values that you believe are important through other organizations and movements that aren't involved in partisan politics. What we are seeing in American politics today is nothing new, though it may seem that it is in more danger of prevailing than in previous waves. For me, that is nothing new, and that is both a source of concern and a source of hope. If we respond purely out of fear, we may ourselves escalate the trend. But we've dealt with this before. We can apply lessons from the past. It may feel good to complain to friends about it, but action is more productive. Step back, breathe deeply, and get back in touch with your compassion, reason, and responsibility. Now is the time that we say goodbye to those who are watching just on video and invite them to participate live some future Sunday or at other events. Our calendar is at rysec.org.